I'm Natalie Alexander. Welcome to AI and Multilateralism, a playlist of conversations here at the Commons, our space at the UN Library and Archives, Geneva, for sharing knowledge on multilateralism. In this series, we're joined by experts who help us unpack the many ideas and issues at the nexus of AI and international cooperation. Today, we speak to Dr. Rachel Adams, the founding CEO of the Global Center on AI Governance. She's also the author of The New Empire of AI, The Future of Global Inequality, an assistant research professor at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, and a globally recognized expert on responsible AI. In this episode, we dive into why more research and policy advice on AI governance and realities led from the African continent is critical, and how multilateralism can harness global governance efforts to stand for the rights and needs of all communities everywhere. Rachel, thank you so much for your time today and joining us.
You're welcome. It's wonderful to be here.
So you are the founding CEO of the Global Center on AI Governance. The center is led from Africa, and its vision is a world where AI technologies and governance is reflective of all of humanity. What prompted you or drove you to establish the Global Center?
Yeah, well, the Global Centre was established towards the end of 2023, and it is an international think tank that's registered in South Africa. So much of our work is led out of South Africa and out of the African region. And together with my co-founder, Dr. Fola Adeleke, we really identified this need for much deeper research and critical reflection and policy advice for the African region, but also internationally, on African realities with regards to AI. It was clear to us that AI had this kind of two prongs to it, which we're all very well aware of. It offers significant transformative potential, particularly on key development issues for the African continent, whether it's precision agriculture or personalized health or more efficient healthcare systems. At the same time, we were very aware, and I was writing and finishing up the book, The New Empire of AI, at that time, that AI was poised to worsen a set of critical global inequalities. And that in order to navigate this really complex terrain, we needed one, deeper, more critical interdisciplinary research to better understand the impacts and implications of AI in very diverse African contexts. But we also needed policy innovations, and we needed people that were able to work with African governments that were local, that were based on the continent and based in the realities, to be able to provide advice to African policymakers around the kind of governance options they had. AI is a very kind of dynamic area, and when we talk about AI governance, it involves a wide range of different kinds of frameworks. And so we knew it would be a very long path, and we needed to establish an institution that would stand the test of time and continue to stand as this kind of critical infrastructure, knowledge infrastructure for African policymakers. And I think the other part of this, much of our work is across the majority world, and we can speak about this, but we also wanted to ensure that African perspectives, priorities, interests, and needs were better reflected in global debates and decision makings around AI. So the AI for Humanity report that the UN was working on came out, just a few months after we launched, and so there was a timeliness to what we were trying to do.
Yeah. And so the Global Center is a few years old now. And of course, you mentioned that there's also been a lot of movement multilaterally in terms of looking at the area of global governance. What would you say are some of the major opportunities or projects that the center is working on to really move forward and see real action in terms of global governance that's reflective of all of humanity?
Yeah, maybe I can speak to two projects that we do, and because we have a lot of educational training programs and courses that we do with the University of Cape Town, the University of Pretoria, and different kinds of capacity building programs with regulatory institutions working in different ways on AI across the continent. So there's a whole range of kind of training and education that we do, but perhaps I can speak to two projects. So one is that we are launching with the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office an AI policy training program. So this is a training program that is aimed at bringing together senior policymakers or diplomats from many countries, but we're starting with the UK and South Africa, and creating a peer learning knowledge environment where they can learn from each other about the different kinds of dynamics that are informing AI policy choices within their distinct countries, and figure out opportunities for deepening bilateral and hopefully international cooperation on AI. So we really recognize that no one country is going to be able to tackle the kinds of issues that are cross-jurisdictional, that are global, that we see with artificial intelligence. And so we need to be thinking about, in this complex multipolar world, how do we strengthen bilateral and multilateral relations in ways that are not just dependent on the existing bodies, but work in different ways to support that kind of engagement. So that's one project that we have. Another one that we've been running, I mean, I've been leading this project since 2021, but it's called the Global Index on Responsible AI, and it's really our flagship project. And so it involves, we spent a very long time designing and conceptualizing a dynamic, multi-dimensional measurement framework for responsible AI. It is a little bit of a misnomer, this term, and I think very often we use it without knowing precisely what does it involve, what are its protocols, what are its particular kind of provisions and requirements. And so through engagement with different groups, from feminist organizations to labor movements to governments across the whole world, and particularly the global majority, we established this measurement framework that was dynamic and inclusive as far as an index can be. And then we designed a questionnaire against that. So it's a questionnaire that takes country researchers. We employ about 150 researchers in every country around the world as a researcher, who completes this very long, detailed questionnaire to ask about the kind of commitments and practices around these different elements of responsible AI, from children's rights to public procurement to transparency registers in their particular country. And then that comes together in an index and a report analysing key global trends on responsible AI. So we published the first edition in 2024, and we're about to publish the second edition in early-ish 2026. But why this is important for multilateral efforts is, one, it provides a kind of global snapshot of the state of responsible AI, and it allows organizations like the UN, and certainly I know OHCR has used this, UNICEF has used this, OECD has referenced this report, and other multilateral organizations. But it allows these organizations to see, how far is this concept something that states are really taking on board, or how far is it just rhetoric? And from that, what are the kind of programs that we need to prioritize in what parts of the world to address critical and major gaps? So one of the major findings from the first edition is that the majority of people around the world are living in places where there are little to no mechanisms to protect human rights at risk from AI. So there might be no mechanisms for redress and remedy should an AI-related harm occur, or no distinct public procurement rules that stipulate the kind of requirements in terms of human rights, protection of human rights, local community rights, for when a government procures an AI system or solution. So I think this index has been particularly valuable because so often multilaterals are working in a space where they have very limited evidence on the countries they most care about. So from Africa, we included 42 countries. From the Caribbean, we had 9. We had a lot from Asia. We had a lot from Latin America. And so this index was able to provide kind of ground truth on these places and regions across the world where organizations like the UN particularly care where efforts around AI and human rights are at.
So a really practical ground level snapshot of what's happening in reality.
Yes, I mean, it doesn't measure the levels of saturation of AI diffusion in any particular country or sector, but it does measure what frameworks of governments put in place to ensure this particular principle of responsible AI, whether it's accountability or do no harm, is made provision for at a national level, how far have governments sought to implement any of these kind of principles or particular issue areas like gender and AI, and what kind of efforts are taking place outside of government. So are universities working on these issues? Are civil society working on these issues? This year, because we really kind of felt like in the first edition, having just an overview of frameworks and how far these frameworks are being implemented and what work civil society and other non-state actors were doing was not the full picture. We've also included some questions around the misuse of AI by governments in order to try and patch together a kind of fuller picture of where we're seeing inappropriate human rights interfering uses of AI in different countries around the world, which we hope will allow us to give a much fuller picture of what responsible AI laws and frameworks are responding to in any given country context.
I'm very curious to hear more about your thoughts on this and what it means, in terms of multilateral decision making. Before we get there, I wanted to explore with you your thoughts and your work at the Center on AI in Africa. The center is led from Africa, and part of it is the African Observatory on Responsible AI, which is working on recent research and a series called Africa and the Big Debates on AI. And in this series, you write that AI in Africa is at a critical inflection point. Tell us about this. What are the key things that we should know about?
Well, I think there's all sorts of things going on around AI across the continent, and we really are at quite a kind of exciting and pivotal moment. So, the African Observatory on Responsible AI is a project like the Global Index on Responsible AI that's supported by the International Development Research Centre of Canada and the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office of the UK under their AI for Development Africa programme, which we work very closely on. And the African Observatory sort of stands as this knowledge hub that supports responsible AI practices and thinking and scholarship across the continent. And one of the things that we've always been very interested in doing is connecting the realities of this increasing movement around artificial intelligence on the continent with the global debates on AI that often feel disconnected from those African realities. So, of course, in the last year or so, and beyond that, there has been an increasing attention to the existential and long-term and safety risks associated with artificial intelligence. Geoffrey Hinton and winning the Nobel Prize last year really threw a lot of this into sharp relief in the media. And I think there's a lot of efforts and thinking going on to understand what risks does AI pose to our societies. And from our perspective, we're interested in what do conversations around artificial general intelligence or superintelligence mean for the African continent and the realities of what we're facing here? And what are the major wide-scale risks that AI may pose to African societies, and how how may that differ? So this debate series that we've published, and we have new pieces coming out every week from our different researchers and collaborators. It's a really, really dynamic and interesting kind of set of think pieces, explores some of these questions from very, very different perspectives. So some of the things we look at is how the drive for artificial general intelligence, which is effectively OpenAI's mission, is galvanizing these significant investments by the US government, millions and billions and trillions of dollars, at the same time as USAID has seen such significant cuts, which has had devastating, very real impacts on the African continent. Much of the impacts around the loss of USAID funding in Africa has prompted an even further and even deeper drive towards artificial intelligence as this key tool that can help make the resources we have work better and work more efficiently. So there's an interesting kind of leap there. But the other one is around some of the kind of broader global supply chain issues, which is where, certainly in my book on the new empire of AI, I looked at what these realities look like. The global AI industry, of which OpenAI is kind of at the peak with NVIDIA and so forth, is dependent on the extraction of resources from continents like Africa and Latin America and other parts, whether it's from, rare earth minerals being extracted from the Great Lakes region to the very kind of wearisome, monotonous, and deeply psychologically troubling work that data labelers and those involved in reinforcement learning of AI systems through human feedback are involved in, often across the African continent. And we've seen the kind of severe whistleblowing around this going on in Kenya. So if we're driving towards artificial intelligence, what greater pressures does this put on the resources on the African continent, and where does that leave opportunities for people to prosper when job opportunities are in gig economies or in these gig work and data labeling work that is short-term contract, precarious, and very, very low paid. And then other issues we explore is around the kind of question of AI alignment, which is one of the kind of key strategies for trying to ensure that the hyper intelligent systems that we build are aligned to human values. And we discuss how the idea of the human has never been stable, it's never been universal. And so whose values and what kind of disciplines are involved in that work of AI alignment, and how might we think about diversifying that? But I think overall we're at this moment where, on the one hand, we're concerned about an AI bubble, and in the African continent we're thinking about how do African governments build their own sovereignty over these complex international AI systems and infrastructure in ways that allow them to harness the potential benefits of these technologies to solve local solutions and to build local growth and local AI ecosystems. And I think this is an ongoing conversation because, as you know, countries outside of the US and China are facing that same question of how do we build independence from these big tech firms so that our futures feel less narrow and more aligned to kind of opening up human and local agency in very, very different ways that we can't anticipate and we don't want to be able to anticipate. So I think that the African context is a very, very interesting moment. And of course, we worked on the African Union's continental AI strategy, and that placed such an emphasis on AI needs to be able to support an African cultural renaissance. And I think this is really exciting. This is really, really fascinating. I'd love to see more investment going into the kind of cultural industries across Africa rather than just the kind of key developmental ones, because these spaces are where new imaginaries of what the future with AI and with digital technologies come from. And so I think are really, really exciting and dynamic.
Coming on top of that, in terms of leveraging this opportunity, leveraging this excitement and creativity that's possible. What do you think then that we need to do at the global level, at the multilateral level, to make sure, as you mentioned, that there is agency in the African continent to govern AI that's fit for all, that's fair for all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the UN has done a very, very good job of talking about the AI divide and the need to put a floor under that, and that being a major focus of what AI global governance should be looking to do, rather than focusing on a set of quite obscure risks that are very much defined from a Western perspective. I think one of the things we must bear in mind is the cost of engaging in multilateral processes.
Mhm.
Western governments have teams of diplomats. They have many, sort of hundreds of people that ensure that there is a representative from each country in every single room where different deliberations are going on, that they're able to access these spaces and represent their interests. So, one of the things that seems really obvious and basic, but we just need to ensure that there's adequate funding and there's adequate kind of understanding around the complexity of visas and travels to ensure that there are enough perspectives from the African continent. And the African continent is diverse and not a kind of singular block or singular voice in these different rooms and in these different places where discussions are going on. So I think when we're thinking about, an international scientific panel and we're thinking about global dialogues, how are we ensuring that African diplomats are adequately and fully and meaningfully kind of represented and able to engage? And then how do we ensure that African publics are also able to engage and reflect on those spaces? Are there opportunities for citizen reviews, like some of the work Connected by Data have been talking about and thinking about, that I think would be very, very valuable for ensuring that fuller global perspectives are brought to bear in this very kind of emerging dialogue around AI. And then on the kind of scientific panel side, we have to recognize that we don't have the precise evidence we think we should have in order to make adequate decisions around how we govern this technology. We are working with a rapidly shifting evidence base. We are working with huge amounts of grey evidence. We are working with massive evidence gaps. We just did a public perception survey on AI in Africa, in South Africa, I'm sorry, and it was the first one that was a kind of rigorous one that was done across the continent. And there's really, really a need for much more evidence collecting around public perceptions and public attitudes and public awareness on AI in different African countries, because our findings in South Africa were quite stark. Almost two-thirds of South Africans either have not heard of AI or don't have any meaningful understanding of what that concept is. So if we extrapolate that to the wider African continent, we're in trouble. But the point is, we need more evidence, and we also need to be able to think about how do we make decisions when we don't have the kind of evidence we think we need to be able to have? What are the kind of principles that help us think through those complex situations? And how do we ensure we have a broad range of disciplinary perspectives that may or may not fall into that kind of narrow idea of what science is? We want to include indigenous perspectives, we want to include humanistic inquiries, and so that we kind of match the complexity of what AI is with the kind of full spectrum, or as full a spectrum of perspectives and understandings and disciplinary backgrounds that we can.
Yeah. Just to go back on what you mentioned about the scientific panel, the General Assembly established the International Independent Scientific Panel on AI and what's called the Global Dialogue on AI Governance this year through resolution in 2025. These mechanisms are to be developed and evolved. But is that your message for those mechanisms, that they try to be as representative as possible of different heritage, perspectives, skills, understandings, literacies around AI?
Yes, I mean, I think that the first thing to do is certainly to make sure you have the right people in the room and to think broadly about what that looks like. So there's a kind of governance and structure question. Have you got the right people around the table? And then there's the kind of content and focus question, and identifying what the issue areas are that AI governance at a global level needs to address is not a settled debate. We face different risks in different parts of the world, yet it's all interconnected in these various ways. And so I think there's still work that needs to be done to really ensure that perspectives from very different parts of the world, including indigenous perspectives, including citizen perspectives and inputs, alongside diplomatic ones, are included as we think through what it is global AI governance needs to respond to and do.
Yeah. You also mentioned something that I found interesting about usability of these technologies. You mentioned in your book that the benefits of technology is not just about accessibility, it's whether it can then be used for the benefit of more people. This might include local languages or incorporating local needs. At the level of the UN or regional mechanisms around multilateralism, what is our responsibility there to make sure that these technologies are usable and deployed for all?
Yes, I think this is a really important and quite complex question. I think
Mm.
one of the kind of major areas we know we need to see more emphasis placed is on the development of these technologies, generative AI technologies, language-based AI technologies in local languages, which sounds like a simple and obvious thing to do, and potentially the UN, with its huge kind of databases of texts in different languages, has data that might be useful to help train technologies in these different languages. But as soon as you have a health chatbot that's able to understand a local dialect or understand somebody speaking in their own language, you're immediately making that technology available to somebody. So the benefits of local language AI technology are really that we can bring these benefits of AI to billions more people, certainly millions more people. At the moment, because AI is largely in dominant languages like English, it is less accurate for contexts outside of English speaking cultures and places, and potentially more biased. And so the risks of using them are higher, but they're higher in places where there are fewer institutions and certainly less institutional capacity to be able to manage and govern a more riskier technology. And so putting priority behind, putting funds behind supporting the development of these technologies in local languages is a really, really important cornerstone to ensuring that not only various people, millions and millions of people, are not left behind, but ensuring that they are less risky for the people that may potentially need these technologies the most.
We have talked a little bit about your book, but I also wanted to share a bit more and talk about your thoughts on it. The book is called The New Empire of AI: The Future of Global Inequality. And in the book, you take us through, the reasons why inequality and growing inequality is a big threat to the potential of AI to transform our world for the better, and essentially is bringing forth a new age of empire. It's been a year since it was released. How are you feeling now about this body of work and what the empire looks like?
I think with the kind of government funding support and the funding that's going into frontier AI technologies, that empire is only growing in might. So, in some ways, some of those imperial conditions that I was speaking about have gotten worse. At the same time, I think we've also seen more groups in very different parts of the world building and utilizing these technologies in ways that are helping local communities or doing something very different and new and exciting. We obviously had the kind of deep seek issue earlier in the year, which undermined that kind of narrative that, well, maybe it didn't undermine, but it showed that the empire could come down, it could be threatened, it could fall. So I think that potentially the space has become more complex, with even greater emphasis on this kind of big bet, right? That we need to put everything behind creating super powerful AI technologies because it's going to solve all our other problems. But at the same time, we're seeing AI developed in more nuanced, interesting, locally exciting ways. And we're seeing more kind of threats to that empire. And we're seeing these questions around the AI bubble. So we're seeing all this money that's being pumped into frontier technologies has not resulted in the productivity boom across different industries that it was supposed to. So in some ways, potentially it's unraveling itself, and we will see whether that bubble potentially bursts, which I hope it does. It's not a miracle technology. It's an exciting one. It holds a lot of promise, but it's not our savior.
You do advocate and mention for what's called a global commons around AI infrastructure, compute data, foundational models. Is this a way that we can leverage the benefits of AI for everyone?
Yes, I mean, I think much of the problem with the AI industry as it stands and with artificial intelligence at the moment is it's completely enveloped in corporate capture, and it's almost entirely for private interests. And so if we're able to shift that so that it is something more of a commons that's available to people around the world and is seen more as something that can help serve public goals, then we've got a very, very different kind of foundation for what the purpose of this technology is, rather than something that's trying to capture our attention and extract more productivity, efficiency, buying power. And instead, it's something that's able to identify problems that we've not been able to see before because we're dealing with such large databases and data sources on these different issues. I mean, it's very difficult to talk about how can it be used for good, because that question can only be answered by people who really, really know what are the problems that we're trying to solve. And how does AI fit within a suite of different tools to help solve these problems? AI is not going to solve hunger, it's not going to solve poverty, but it may be part of a set of solutions alongside greater international cooperation and thinking through how we better utilize food waste or whatever it might be. But in and of itself, it is not the solution to any of our significant problems. It's just part of a set of solutions if we really understand what it can do and what it can't do, and why it might be relevant in particular areas and why it might not be relevant in particular areas. If we want to see it becoming more of a commons, we need people everywhere to know about it, know what its risks are, know what its benefits are, and utilize it in their own ways. I mean, that's the promise of artificial intelligence, is it's not a predefined tool, it's a set of possibilities and a tool for you to do whatever you might want to do with it. So for me, one of the biggest gaps that we face is around public literacy and awareness. If almost 2/3 of South Africans don't have a meaningful grasp of AI, then what promise does this technology hold to liberate people across the African continent? So for me, I think we really need to be thinking about what are the opportunities to raise awareness, to deepen people's understanding, to enable people to make their own choices about how they want to use this technology. I think that's going to be where the real transformation in AI takes place over the next few years.
Really interesting. And on that note, for our listeners, do you have an open source resource that you could recommend for us to learn more?
Well, all the work that we do is openly available on our website, globalcentre.ai, and there's also global-index.ai, where the Global Index on Responsible AI, all the data is open access, and you can explore a kind of huge repository of what countries all over the world are doing, and civil society, university, private groups around the world are doing to kind of advance different responsible AI initiatives. So I hope that that's a really interesting and exciting resource for people to tap into.
We'll make sure the Global Index and the website is in the show notes. Dr. Rachel Adams, thank you so much. All the best as you continue this work.
Thank you so much.